I don't want to lose time here, so I will tell you a bit about, and as you're joining, please put your role and your name in the chat and ask any questions at any time. But I will tell you a little bit about us here at the Grand Families and Kinship Support Network at Generations United. We're one of the authors and participants in this whole process of creating kid-specific foster care licensing standards. And so pleased to be able to share this webinar with you today. We here at the network, which is at Generations United, this is our fourth year of a cooperative agreement with the Administration for Community Living, and we're here to help states, tribes, and territories with any needs they have around supporting kinship families. So that is our purpose. We support all those systems that are in this umbrella, in addition to nonprofits, community-based nonprofits, small or large. So we are here. If you have any questions, we can connect you with subject matter experts like Heidi Redlich-Epstein and Marina Nitza, who are both part of our work together. So we host webinars like the one today, and this link will take you to a series of webinars and past webinars as well. We also respond to individual requests for assistance. All you have to do is complete that short form, and we will get back to you. We have technical assistance specialists on staff, and as I said, that whole cadre of subject matter experts, including Heidi and Marina. And then we have a website with over 100 original resources to help you help the families. So you'll see this is a shot of our homepage of our website. And we have a full resource library, and the webinars are kept there under the events tab. I am so pleased, and thanks to the heroic effort of Heidi and the American Bar Association Center on Children in the Law for designing this. I know if many of you have worked with these kin-specific licensing standards, they've been in a Google Drive and haven't been designed, but now they're in a beautiful designed PDF, and you can access them at this link on the grandfamilies.org website. And I also want to share one other resource with you, which is on the Grand Families and Kinship Support Network website, which is a series of frequently asked questions that we've collected from past webinars. So this is the third in our series of webinars on this subject. We had one when the final rule allowing for kin-specific standards was first enacted. And then we had another one talking about the progress last April, and you'll hear again from a couple of those panelists and how the progress is continuing. So know that this is a resource to you as well, and it links to those past webinars if you'd like to watch them or listen to them. So it is my privilege to be joined by all these fabulous presenters today, including, as I mentioned, Marina and Heidi, who are subject matter experts at the Grand Families and Kinship Support Network, along with their many other hats that they wear. Sonia Silva, who works with Marina closely at Bloomworks and does a lot of the work in creating these tools and resources that accompany the kin-specific licensing standards. And then we're going to hear from 4 jurisdictions. We're going to hear from Michigan, Tennessee, Maryland, and Port Gamble-Sklallam Tribe. So you'll see their names here, and I will let them introduce themselves when they start talking, but know that we're very privileged to have Jessica Bodell, Lindsay Coleman, Cheryl Miller, and Joylina Gonzalez, and of course, Becky Rice. So thank you all for joining us today, and I am going to turn it over now to Marina.
Thank you so much. I thought I would do a quick 5-minute refresh on the model standards and kin licensing. I see some of you have probably heard me say this 10 times, but for anybody that has not, we'll do a quick review. So where we started, we had decades where the federal rule required jurisdictions to have the same licensing standards for kin and for non-kin, and that was not working. Across the country, the vast majority of kinship caregivers who were caring for children were not licensed, and that in many places, not all, but many, meant that they had little or no financial support. And in some jurisdictions, it actually prevented kin placement entirely. In areas where kin licensing was required, the standards for kin were the same as non-kin, and there was little to no flexibility around things like maybe it's okay for a 17-year-old to sleep on grandma's couch, whereas it would not necessarily be okay for us to place a 17-year-old with strangers and have them sleep on the couch there. As of the end of 2023, though, thanks to the advocacy for many of you in the audience, The federal government updated the rule so that agencies have the option to adopt a kin-specific licensing or approval process that recognizes the unique needs of kinship caregivers. And then under this new process, similar to the previous process, payments to these licensed or approved kinship caregivers would be eligible for federal financial participation for the foster care maintenance payments, assuming they were otherwise Title 40 eligible. The federal rule only has two requirements, and these are the same requirements that actually have been around for a while. The first requirement is that your licensing process has to be reasonably in accordance with the recommended standards of national organizations. And that's us. We're national organizations, and we wrote model standards. Heidi and Anna published the NARA model standards in 2018. Did I get that right? Okay.
What was the update? Yep.
For when we had to have the same licensing standards for everybody. And now we have a new model standard set that is designed for the needs of kin caregivers specifically. And then the second part of the federal requirement, which has remained unchanged, is that the caregiver and or other adults in the home need to fully meet federal background check requirements. So the new model standards, as mentioned, were co-written by a number of organizations, some of whom were here now, other ones are not here today, but contributed heavily. This is the only set of kin-specific model standards. So in theory, I guess there could be others in the future, but right now these are the only ones. So therefore, the federal rule means that you have to be reasonably in accordance with these model standards. And very simply, the kin model standards include the required background checks. They include an assessment of the caregiver and a safety and needs assessment of the home. And Sonia will talk a little bit about this after me of how these were designed, but we really want to emphasize that they were co-designed with virtually every Title 40 agency, subject matter experts, and kinship caregivers directly to understand where were people getting stuck, like your hot water temperature couldn't exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, maybe we needed a little bit more flexibility around something like that, right? So this is a map of who participated in co-designing, and we looked at the forms and the processes of every Title 40 agency out there to work backward from those. We took basically, it's like a wonderful Frankenstein's monster of what was working really well in different places, where there were still barriers, and then how could we work with the people that were impacted, the agency workers, the families, the subject matter experts to design something that still absolutely holds safety paramount, but recognizes the unique situations of kinship caregivers and families, and gave flexibility to agencies that workers wanted. Nobody became a social worker. I've never met one. I don't believe they exist because they wanted to tell grandma that her 18-year-old dog, who was too old to get a rabies vaccination and the vet wouldn't give it one, therefore couldn't get licensed and couldn't take in their child. Nobody became a social worker to tell grandma, sorry, choose between your dog and your grandchild. So expected benefits, we're looking for 100% equitable support for kinship caregivers relative to non-kinship caregivers, more kin placements, more kin guardianship, and we'll hear more about this later. And then one more minute on this, just reminding of the federal background checks. It's fingerprint-based check for the kinship caregivers, checking the child abuse and neglect registry of any state where they lived in the last 5 years, and then any adult living in the home, checking the child abuse and neglect registry of any state where they lived in the last 5 years. These are the federal requirements. We added ones that all of you are doing anyway. All of you are checking sex offender registry. All of you are doing name-based in-state background checks. And so we added those as part of the model standards as well. And with that, Sonia, I'm going to pass it to you to share a little bit more about what's in the model standards. We've got these form templates and other tools that jurisdictions that are adopting will find valuable. But let me show you the progress, which we are crazily excited about. You're going to hear from panelists today who have gone live, to include Michigan. It went live almost a year ago, which is pretty crazy. We are going to hear from them about what's been working, what advice they have for you. But we're looking at basically the whole rest of the country going live in the next year or two, which is pretty amazingly exciting. So with that, Sonia, I will pass it to you.
Great. Thank you so much for that intro, Marina. I think Madeline will get our slides up. In the meantime, I'm Sonia. I am a user experience researcher working for Bloomworks on the child welfare team. And I'm going to walk through some of the templates for assessing kin caregivers that Marina was just talking about. So Bloom, if you haven't heard of us before, we are a women-owned public benefit company, and we use human-centered design to center people and their lived experiences when working with governments and nonprofits. And the child welfare team that I'm a part of has been working with different agencies and nonprofits at the state and national level over the last few years. So today we'll just show you the co-design of the forms, talk about that really briefly, background check forms, and the kin caregiver assessment. So co-designing for equity. This is an approach that we take to our work, and that's really by centering the voices and lived experiences of people. So for example, kin caregivers, that was a huge part of this work, and people, former foster youth. And the goal of this really was to enable more kinship families to be approved, licensed, and provided with financial support, with that new federal rule providing an opportunity to do so. So in terms of our approach, we heard here from a child welfare worker on the existing approach to licensing or approving kin caregivers. And they said it's always been very focused on how are you meeting or not meeting our standards versus how can we support you and take care of this. And so you'll see in some of the templates that we developed when you dive into them, how many of the questions were framed around what supports could be provided to better support that approval of a kin caregiver. So first we'll go through our background checks and what we learned and their intent. So we want to elevate what we learned from kin caregivers. And we heard from them it was important to understand how the background check process can help them, help protect them, and keep the child with them. So as we know, there's distrust of child welfare agencies, and really communicating this was important to assuage some of those fears. To know what to expect throughout the process and how sensitive information would be used was really important, as well as to give written consent to how their information would be used and shared. They really wanted a record of what they were consenting to. And it's too hectic in the moment sometimes to process everything that is coming their way. As well as to have all of the necessary information collected at once, ideally within one day, and ideally within one location as possible, rather than spreading these checks over multiple points in time. So we're going to show just a few screenshots of the forms here. These links will be available to you after and shared in the chat. So the application form, this is for the agency staff to fill out with the kin caregiver. It has a cover page, which is for the caregiver to keep, which details what they can expect going through the process. There are instructions that explain why demographic information is being collected, and also a recommendation for sharing a list of any of the disqualifying crimes up front, so kin caregivers are aware of what those disqualifying crimes are. As well as the consent form, this is a one-stop shop consent form that covers all of the background checks, and it's for the kin caregiver and each adult in the home to fill out. The form explains what checks will be completed and their rights. It's also a copy is to be shared with each person who signs, and caregivers sign one consent form to cover all of these. So we have a criminal history evaluation form for evaluating non-automatically disqualifying crimes. And there is, this is for the agency staff to fill out based on conversation with the kin and other adults in the home that are filling it out, as well as evaluation criteria, which are based on input from agencies and caregivers. And then there is the denial and appeal letter, should this be necessary. This is a notification form that explains the denial of a kin caregiver explanation. It also instructs or guides caregivers on starting the appeal process if they're eligible for that. And it's meant to supplement, not replace critical conversations that should be happening between applicants and caseworkers, should this be the decision. And next, we're going to go over to the kin caregiver assessment form. And we have a quote here from a kin caregiver on their support needs. And they said, when I went from 3 to 7 kids, it required more food. Had they asked me if I was able to provide food to all of the kids, I would have said yes. I would have never told the caseworker I need help because of fear. I went to get SNAP. And again, we elevate this because of how important it is to ask people what they need and to say what can be available and provided rather than relying on people to ask for help. That was a big thing that we heard from kin. So some overall things that we learned is that the assessments of the home and kin caregiver are happening at the same time. So for some of you who've been on this journey for a while, you might have formally heard of some of the steps as safety and needs assessment and suitability. So we collapsed those into one form called the kin caregiver assessment. And we went away with the term suitability, which was confusing to virtually everybody we spoke to. As well, the intersectionality of identities is important to take into account. So there are some questions around identity in the form and the children's identities and how that can be supported. It's important to ask kin caregivers what they need and to offer that support as well. And as you go forth and develop these forms, experiencing tension, friction, discomfort can be productive to developing form development. We experienced that along the way. So it's okay if you disagree as you're building these. And it's important to test questions and forms before wider rollouts. So pilot these, iterate and be led by the data and the information you're gathering along the way. So what does this assessment include? There is a section on caregiver discussion questions, which includes their communication needs, relationships and needs, the children's needs, their parenting approach, and the caregiver's health. And there's also questions on the physical home safety, which includes conditions of the home, hazardous material storage, emergency preparedness, and sleeping arrangements. And so the templates that we developed here include the kin caregiver assessment form, which is a designed version of the form. There's also an agency training guide that has annotations explaining the context for each question and considerations to have in mind, as well as an assessment question bank, which is an editable version of the form that has all of the annotations and detail in the agency training guide. So the kin caregiver assessment form is really meant to assess kin caregivers during home studies as part of the licensing process. And it's really meant to be filled by agency staff and shared with kin caregivers in advance. So really to use it more as a conversational guide. Don't share it in advance to have kin caregivers fill it out. So that's the intention of how to use it. It's also used to identify what kin caregivers are already capable of and how to support those placements and how to meet caregiver and children's needs equitably across different populations and settings. For the agency training guide, this is an annotated version, as I mentioned, with explanations. You can see in this red box here, above each question, we've added an annotation that you can have available for your own internal use. This is created for staff training and how to provide guidance on how to conduct the caregiver assessment and guidance on what led to the development of those questions. But a copy of this doesn't need to be provided to kin caregivers. And then we have the caregiver assessment question bank. This is a document that can be copied and edited. So it can be used by agencies that are wanting to select and edit their questions to update their own kin caregiver assessments or home studies. And it includes all of the annotations and guidance in the training guide. It also includes questions that have been excluded from the assessment as well. So how you can use the forms. So since we've developed these forms, as you'll hear about today, some places are doing this work on making changes. And we've done some work with a few agencies as well and helping them adapt their forms. And how to implement the form changes, use the kin model standard form templates to customize your own versions, use plain language for questions that you're required to add for clarity and understanding. All the forms we developed, they did go through some plain language edits. Pilot and test forms and documents with the different groups you work with, like kin caregivers, community partners, fellow child welfare staff, and continue to center the lived experiences and feedback of kin caregivers you work with when doing this. So if you want to learn more, the links to these documents, as we mentioned, will be shared in the chat. And you can always drop us a note at bloom-kinship@bloomworks.digital if you have any questions or comments for us. Now I'm gonna hand it back over to move to the next presenter.
Thank you. Heidi, you are up next.
Thank you. And a giant round of thank you to Bloomworks, who spent an enormous amount of time and energy and resources putting together those tools and templates, which are going to be incredibly helpful to the jurisdictions who are implementing this. I cannot underscore more how important it is to have a template to go from and be able to modify it in your own jurisdiction as opposed to starting from scratch. So big round of applause to Bloomworks. Really appreciate it. That was very in the weeds. I'm going to go kind of bigger and broader and talk about when creating kinship approval and licensing standards, how do you define kin? What are the requirements for defining kin? So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the federal definition of how you are supposed to, as a 4E agency, define relative or kin for purposes of licensing was addressed in the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which came out in February of 2023, again and again in the Child Welfare Policy Manual, with a consistent message that all Title IV agencies have a discretion to define relative and kin themselves. This is not a federal definition that's going to be provided, but instead looking at the 4E agencies to define them. They will also, the Children's Bureau encouraged the definition to be broad, inclusive of tribal customs, when looking at who you're going to define as kin or relative for purposes of licensing. Finally, the federal government, the only other caveat they've given is it needs to be in your 4E plan, but it doesn't need to be in statute. So that's really a decision that's made sort of on a case-by-case basis by the jurisdiction. Next slide. So when putting together these model standards, we kind of wanted to come up with our own suggested and recommended definition of relative or kin for purposes of licensing or approval. And so we used obviously a pretty broad one that we feel can be easily adapted to your jurisdiction, which is on the screen here. Individuals related to a child by blood, marriage, tribal custom, and or adoption, and other individuals who have emotionally significant relationship with the child or the child's parents or other family members. Some of you refer those folks to those folks as fictive kin. Also want to stress the need to recognize the great diversity in Indian country and the sovereign authority of tribes to define relative themselves. And then finally, making sure that you realize that relationships should not, in your definition and in our recommendations, be restricted by how the degree of relation to the child, as well as not being restricted by the fact that when a parent's rights are terminated, whether you can look at grandmother or grandfather or aunt or uncle, even though the rights have been terminated, really wanting to make sure that you think of those 2 points when defining relatives for licensing. We know that many states may prioritize certain categories of kin over others, but really wanting to make sure that the way that you lay out your standards makes it eligible for anybody under this broad definition to qualify to become a licensed kinship home. Next slide. And then I really want to stress again, this is a jurisdictional definition, something that has to be done by the 4E agency themselves. And that just because you're going to define relative or kin for the purposes of licensing, it does not, I repeat, does not need to match the way you define relative or kin for other child welfare purposes. And I know that can get a little confusing, but when you think of things like under fostering connections requiring a notice to all relatives, how you define what that group of all relatives might look a little different than how you're going to define those who can qualify to become licensed kinship care providers. So really knowing that you have that flexibility to define them differently for different purposes within child welfare. The other thing you have the flexibility to do as a 4E agency is not necessarily match that definition of relative or kin as defined by other agencies. And we see this a lot with child-only TANF, that they may define relative very narrowly, which does not mean as a 4E agency looking at child welfare, you need to stay to that same narrow definition. And then finally knowing, again, as I had said before, that the way you define relative or kin, it might be in code, it might be in law, it might be in policy. It really depends on your jurisdiction's structure. Next slide. And something that I want to point out that we have recently launched is a kin standards implementation tool with 5 steps on whether you are in the process of implementing, you have already implemented, you're just thinking about implementing, but really laying out, here are some things to keep in mind as you're putting together your model standards, but also as you're implementing those model standards. And that's available, you'll see on that link on grandfamilies.org. So, thank you, and turn it back over to the moderators.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We are going to move to our panel now. If my panelists, you have already joined me. Fabulous. So I was hoping we could go around and you could first introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your agency, and when did you first go live with kin-specific licensing or approval? And Jessica, I'll look to you first.
All right, great. Thanks, Marina. Jessica Bodell. I'm the Relative Approval and Placement Specialist for the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. I work within our Children's Services Administration within the Bureau of Out-of-Home Services. And in my role, I manage our state policies and forms related to relative approval and placement. And I also oversee a variety of different relative programming initiatives, including leading our Kinship Advisory Council and directing our Kinship Navigator program. So to give a little bit of context on our kinship framework, as of January, there were around 9,000 children in an out-of-home placement. And of those 9,000 children, approximately 53% were placed with a relative. And then on March 4th of last year, Michigan implemented relative approval. That's what we refer to as our kin-specific process. And then on March 28th, our state plan was approved by HHS.
Thank you. Lindsay.
Hi, everybody. Lindsay Coleman. I'm the Executive Director of Child Programs and the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, and my role is to manage programs associated with foster care, adoption, foster parent support, independent living, and interstate compact on placement of children. So the kinship standards fall under my purview and in my role at the agency. We started doing our kinship approval standards or changed them, and they were effective on the 7th of March last year. And we were very excited, very excited to get that done. So Tennessee's been a kin-friendly state, so it was a pretty easy transition for us, but I think that's a question for later. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. Becky.
Hi, everybody. My name is Becky Rice, and I am the Acting Director of Out-of-Home Care at the Maryland Social Services Administration in Baltimore, Maryland. And we have approximately 3,700 children who are in out-of-home care at this time. And we're referring to our system change as Kin First. Family Matters Kin First, and we are excited to be here today and be part of this panel.
Thanks, Becky. And Joylina.
Hi, good morning, Marina. My name is Cheryl Miller, and I'm the Director of Children and Family Services. And I wanted to introduce our team members that are joining us on this call today, which is Joylina Gonzalez. She is our Child Welfare Program Manager, and also Sierra Hanna, who is our foster care licenser and does all of our placements for us. We're with the Port Gamble-Sklallam tribe. We're located in Washington State. We are a small tribe, but we have a number of services. Just within our Children and Families Department, we operate TANF, SNAP, maternal home visiting, child welfare, which includes our Direct 40 foster care licensing, and all of our kinship programs. We also operate child support, vulnerable adult, special needs case management, a food bank, and we oversee the youth and the elders programs, and we coordinate that within the tribal community. So thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl and Joylina. Glad to have you all here. So first question for the panel. Can you explain a little bit about what was the process like going live? So Lindsay, I'll ask you first.
Sure, that's a great question. I think it was a little bit like building the bicycle as we rode it, but in a good way. I'd say we did utilize a lot of the resources that Marina and team had provided. We did a crosswalk of what we currently had going on, and then what changes would be made, so that it was very clear what changes in policy need to be made, and then also like what information we needed to message to staff. I think initially we had some go-getters that were like, yeah, this is gonna be awesome. And then we had some folks who were like, oh no, I don't think we should do this. So we were all across the spectrum about how our staff responded to the change. But we basically put like, here's what we're gonna do. And we think that we may have to make some adjustments along the way. And we have over the past year. But just letting people know that there's room for feedback, and we've made transitions over time. So our implementation piece wasn't too difficult because we did already have kinship foster care available for foster families. And the main change for us was just the requirement for training, what types of training, and working that out. I think over time ended up ended up working out really well. But it was kind of like riding the bicycle or building it as we rode it. But I think because of the input that everybody had and the feedback, and then the commitment to make adjustments along the way if things don't work out well, or we need to ask a question different, or we're not getting the feedback that we want in this particular location, or this particular topic, that relatives often deal with. But because we offered that, I think it was a lot easier to embrace the change. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it.
And you did not have to change regulation or law in Tennessee.
Correct. Yeah. We just had to change our policy, which seems like a real easy thing to do, but there are a lot of people that touch it. So, but yeah, we just changed our policy and then submitted our plan.
Got it. Thank you so much. Becky, what was your experience? I think you had to add a new chapter to regulations.
Yes, we did. So our regulations and our policy and our assessment forms went live in December. So these major changes are still just a couple months for us. And so far, so great. But we started by changing the law in Maryland that expanded the definition of a kinship caregiver and modernized the language. Then we had to write an entire COMAR chapter on licensing, supporting, and assessing kinship caregivers. And after that, we had to draft the policy and the assessment form. So for us, it was really looking at those four things. They had to come together before we could start, providing training to our staff and really getting in, starting to change the practice. One thing that was really exciting, though, about when we were writing our regulations and drafting this new COMAR chapter that would allow us to have the separate licensing process, is that we were able to remove a lot of barriers that existed when we were licensing like resource homes, which is how we used to license all of our kinship caregivers as well. And one of the things, I just have to throw it out there, that we were able to remove as like an automatic barrier were bunk beds. Bunk beds were something that I know had been prohibited by COMAR in Maryland for years. And sometimes that made it really difficult to keep siblings together, to keep kids with relatives, depending on the size of the home. So that's just one small but powerful example of the changes that we were able to make when we drafted this new COMAR chapter. And I think other exciting stuff I can tell you. Oh, one thing I'm also super excited about is some of the language that we were able to change in COMAR, because I think, there is still stigma around kinship caregivers, just like there's still stigma around resource parents. And the words that we use when we are talking about people matter. So a few that we changed, we no longer refer to children as foster youth or foster children. In our policy, COMAR and forms, they are children in care, children in out-of-home care, but it's putting the child before their situation, less stigmatizing. Another is instead of fictive kin, we are calling those caregivers family by choice. Chosen family is what some people like. But that is what we use in our policies, COMAR and forms. And one of my personal favorites, instead of the monthly board payment that our kinship caregivers now receive and our resource parents receive, we're calling it a monthly care stipend. We don't board children. We care for children. People board dogs. Not even everybody boards their dogs, but just the message that can send, that this is about caring for the child, not just boarding them. So it's a work in progress, but I just wanted to share that too, because I think this has provided an opportunity to change our practice in ways that we didn't even expect it to.
Thank you so much. So Port Gamble, what was it like going live for you? What was your process like?
Marina, I'm going to let Joy take this next question, but I forgot to say we were officially approved from ACF in November of 24, but it was effective in August of 24. And we currently have 8 children in a dependency and 21 in a guardianship. And I'll turn it over to Joy and Sierra for the rest of the questions.
Good morning here in Washington. So getting started, we have 8 kids in care, and we are actually a really small team. And so it's kind of very different, going from tribes and what states do. But with us, we have a lot of various job duties. And so I think the hardest part or what we really had to do was really get together. And so we developed a team who was going to be, when we decided we were going to go ahead and go forward with this, we had to develop a team, and it was our foster care license coordinator, Sierra. It was myself, our child welfare team. It was our director, Cheryl, and then we had our in-house attorney. And so we all kind of got together on what we wanted to look at, and then we actually brought it and started talking to are licensing foster parents right now, also our kinship caregivers, and just community members. What worked for them, what didn't work for them, what was good, what would they like to see happen. And so we really kind of got all together, really started working on those procedures and submitting everything what we were going to submit. And then once we kind of got down to that in our procedures, our process, we had to go actually before our, it's called a CFS foster or advisory board, and we had to present it to them. And that's kind of like our process. We actually go before the board. We talk to them. This is what we would like to do. This is how many hours that we're asking for. This is, the background checks that we want, UAs or all these other kind of questions that we were presenting to them. And they came back with some feedback to us, and then we implemented that. So it's very different compared to states. I mean, we may not have to go through all the different, regulations and getting policies all going through. Really, we just have to come up and find the time to really meet to put it all together and go before our board and get the approval.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. What I love about this panel, I mean, I love all of you, but I think it's showing there's many paths to doing kin licensing, right? It's not one size fits all, and everybody has the same process. So Jessica, what was it like in Michigan?
Sure. So Michigan's licensing rules are tied to statutes and administrative rules, but we, like Tennessee, chose to create a separate approval path for relatives outside of the traditional licensing process, and really do it through our existing policies. And we were able to do that because our existing policy already very closely aligned with those federal minimum standards for claiming. So to avoid any unnecessary delays, we just took the policy path. For us, we built in relative approval to really our relative placement process. So the only requirements that we added were fingerprints for our relative caregivers, just the caregivers, not the household members. And then we added a fingerprint assessment that workers would complete after those fingerprint results were obtained. But very minimum, again, fingerprints was the only extra piece our relatives had to do outside of the placement assessments. And so, we were uniquely positioned to do it this way because we didn't have any state laws that prevented us from proceeding through policy updates alone. And as far as like the planning and rollout, as soon as we knew the rule change was coming, we started planning and implementing. Our whole process took about a year. We had to update the policy. We had to make form changes. We had to ensure we had staffing to process the increase in fingerprints. Of course, federal claiming changes were needed. And since we were doing it through a different process than licensing, that had to be fully developed in our current system, lots of communications with our private agency partners, leadership, multiple trainings and formal communications for staff were developed. But that in general is the process we had.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. All right. So the next question for the panel is, what was your biggest challenge in adopting the new standards? And Cheryl, I'll look to you first.
So I'm going to actually take this one.
Great. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm scared. I think our biggest challenge was finding the time to create the forms and work on the regulations because we are a small team and we all have other various job duties that I think that was probably our biggest challenge.
Yeah. Well, if anybody has a time expansion machine, I think we would all really like those. Jessica, so you guys had a communication challenge that I think is very instructive for others that are going live. Could you talk about that?
Right. We did not anticipate that. So in general, though, our implementation really was smooth. But like Marina said, miscommunication in media reports created a huge amount of confusion among our kinship caregivers. For those kinship caregivers that were caring for kin outside of the child welfare system. So media outlets incorrectly reported that all kinship caregivers, not just those involved in the formal child welfare system, would now receive financial support. So when these media articles came out, these caregivers outside of child welfare were like, oh, thank goodness, we've been heard. We're going to start getting financial assistance. And so that resulted in many calls, emails from kinship caregivers. They were calling our state representatives, community partners, our kinship navigator program. We were essentially inundated with calls who were initially calling to say, hey, how do I take advantage of this great opportunity and apply? And then when they found out they can't, they changed their narrative to, as you would imagine, express significant frustration once they learned that the change didn't have any impact on their current situation. So we had to spend a lot of resources trying to clarify, correct the messaging. And then, to top it off, we had community agencies outside of child welfare that are involved with our kinship caregivers, not in child welfare, who were super excited and then spread the message themselves, which just further amplified the misinformation and confusion.
Well, we are sorry you experienced that, but we are grateful that you shared it, because I think literally everybody that went live after you and is going live, that is something to plan for and watch out for. Becky, what was the biggest challenge for you in Maryland?
So I thought a lot about how to answer this question, because overall our process was really streamlined, very intentional, very planned out. Personally, I found the entire thing challenging, every step of the process, but in the best way ever, because it really forced us to come together, like as a state and as a state office with our local departments of social services in the state, with our kinship caregivers, our resource parents, and it really forced us to think outside of the box and to figure out how we could how we could make this happen and how we could move with a sense of urgency. And that's really what we did. With the laws that we were able to change, the regulations that went into effect, the policy and the assessment forms. Everything was challenging in its own way, but nothing was, unnecessarily challenging. And I feel really, really grateful for that. I do just have to give one plug. Something that was incredibly helpful, Marina, was your team and the Bloomworks team who made it possible for us to not start from scratch. Because I think if we had to start from scratch with figuring out what to require, what to recommend, as well as just drafting assessment forms, that would have been incredibly challenging. And I think if that wasn't the case, then I would be able to sit here and tell you, that there were, more challenges that we faced.
Well, thank you for that. We everybody was so generous with your time and energy to help give feedback, and you gave good feedback too, Becky. In particular, you early and often. It was like, hey, this can't be 45 pages, and so it was very appreciated. And we hope that resource will continue to be useful for others as they're adopting it. So, Lindsay, how about you? What was challenging? What was the biggest challenge in Tennessee?
So I think the biggest challenge for us has been how to manage when kids are placed with providers. So in Tennessee, we have our own foster homes, like foster homes that we manage. We consider them level 1 traditional foster homes. And then we have contract provider agency homes or therapeutic foster homes. And then of course, kinship homes are managed by DCS as well. Well, what ended up happening, I think that we weren't expecting, is what to do when you find a kinship option for a child who's in a contracted placement with a provider, because their requirement to use that relative would still be to do all of the training, right? Like all of the requirements to be a therapeutic provider. And we weren't expecting that to be an issue. And so initially we got a lot of calls from folks going, what are we going to do about this? And trying to check with TennCare, which is our Medicaid, Medicare in Tennessee, to talk about like, well, we bill for some of this. Like, is it going to be a problem if we do kinship licensing? To make a long story short, we did find a kind of a workaround of doing shared homes for the time being. I think we are hopeful that we can find like a kinship rate. So like a rate that we could assign for therapeutic foster care who ends up with a relative option. Because what we don't want to do is push providers or de-incentivize providers to find relatives, right? Like we want them to keep finding them. And if they know that we're going to end their contract because they found a relative, we don't want to, not that any of our providers would do that, but we don't want to de-incentivize them in that way. So I think that's something we're still, like we made it, and then we initially didn't expect that to happen. We made an initial adjustment. And then I think we're looking at long-term planning on how we can make that situation better.
That is a great call out. And I know some of our early user research with private agencies that we're licensing was that, the incentives are something you need to think about because kin caregivers don't always stay on and take additional children, right? So sometimes a private agency investing all of that time and staff resource into a kinship caregiver does not make financial sense. And it's not that they're bad people or anything like that, but thinking through that, what are the implications, I think is really critically important. So thanks for sharing that. So I'm excited about the next question. Talk about what impacts have you seen since going live? Like, is time and care going down or guardianship going up? Kin placement rates higher? Anything like that that you can share? I would love to hear it. Port Campbell, I'll look to you first.
So since I'm going to answer this one again, we just got approved not that long ago. So the impact that we expect to see is maybe some of our caregivers moving forward with licensing, because that was also like trying to convince them to go through the whole licensing packet is challenging. So that's kind of what we hope to see is that they'll move forward with the kin specific.
Yeah, makes sense. Jessica, how about you?
Sure. So since Michigan was already paying our relative providers and offering that level of support without licensure, the biggest impact has been on the percentage of relatives who are now approved, ultimately increasing our state's ability to make those 4E claims. So before we implemented relative approval, only 13% of children were placed with a licensed relative provider, right? So resulting in very few 4E claims being made. So as of January, that number has grown to 41% of children being placed in an approved relative home. What I want to clarify about that percent is, when we went live on March 4th, we only required new relative providers with a placement on March 4th or after to go through the approval process. So relatives who already have placement before March 4th were encouraged but not required to become approved. So over time, as those legacy relatives phase out or essentially opt into approval, because again, it's not required, we expect our overall approval numbers to continue to increase. And then the last thing I wanted to say about this is not something that we've seen yet, but I want to talk about the guardianship rates really quickly. Unfortunately, our current state statute requires full licensure, right? The regulatory licensure for GAP eligibility. And with only 13% of children placed with an unlicensed or with a licensed relative provider, that means very few of our families are eligible to pursue GAP. So we've been very actively working on updating the statute. And I know that we will see an increase in the number of relatives who pursue GAP once it goes through.
Yeah, I'm excited about that. I think Michigan is one of the states that will possibly see it the most, in Marina's personal opinion. But for other states in your shoes, I think that will be a big jump. And many caregivers, as I think we all know, can tell you that they don't necessarily want to go to a termination trial with their own child, right? That guardianship, it can work a lot better for a lot of families, and this will unlock that as a similar offering. So that's an outcome I'm really excited about. Lindsay, how about in Tennessee? What have you seen?
So I think the biggest thing that we've seen is the cost savings, actually. I mean, I know it sounds terrible to be the part that we mentioned, but we've estimated a cost savings of like $435,000 a year by adopting the standards. And that's just by eliminating the training requirements, eliminating like home study contracts that we had. So I think that that's like a piece that's worth mentioning, particularly if you're trying to convince like a legislature or something like that, that this is a good thing. It was one of the points that we had initially made when we were rolling out and making decisions about kinship. The other piece I think it's been way easier for staff. Like over time, it just becomes an easier situation. And it's also really, of course, a lot easier for families. I think we've heard from families, of course, they don't know what it would have looked like otherwise, right? But anecdotally, you know that it's better to have one visit than three. It's better to have fill out 5 forms than 20. You know, like like there's all those things that you know that happen with kin caretakers. We have not seen a huge increase in kinship caregivers, but I wonder if that's because we were already paying kinship caregivers beforehand, and again, they don't really know the difference in signing up. And we also in Tennessee have a non-custodial kinship program where families who are don't have children in foster care can receive a subsidy from the state to care for their relatives without any involvement from our agency. So a lot of families go that route as well if they're eligible. So I think that although we haven't seen a huge increase, I do think that we will see some permanency increases, particularly around subsidized permanent guardianship. With that time frame, in our state, you aren't required to be fully approved; you're just required to be approved. So that's the good news. And I do think as time goes by and staff really grasp that a little bit more, like, do we have to move forward with this termination? I think that we will see some more expedited permanency, particularly one of the not rumors, but I guess the misconceptions I think we have is that with subsidized permanent guardianship, they have to rule out all of the other options. But what does ruling out really mean? And I think for some people, ruling out means, oh gosh, we can't win a TPR. But ruling out really could just mean we think it's better to do for this child and this family to do it this way. So I think we're trying to really work on educating staff to understand that piece. But I do think we expect to see some at least more timely permanency when we're doing subsidized permanent guardianship.
Thank you. Those are great examples. And Becky, I know you guys have gone live more recently. I know you have at least one kid sleeping in a bunk bed that they really wanted. So that's
You are absolutely right about that. Yes. So yes, we did just go live in December. So our data team is actively working on tracking everything and pulling those numbers. So I don't have that to share with you today, but we know that we're going to see an increase in children who are placed in licensed kinship homes because our new regulations and policy and forms make it possible for all of our kinship caregivers to become licensed. It is truly like a mutual assessment, where we will be helping the kinship caregivers if there are things that they need to change in their home, or things, that we need to walk them through. So moving forward, all of our kinship caregivers in Maryland will be licensed and therefore eligible to receive the monthly care stipend. Before our regulations and policies went live, only 25% of our kinship caregivers who were caring for kids in out-of-home care were licensed. And so we know that can only go up. And we're also, in addition to working on licensing all of our new kinship caregivers, so when kids come into care, we are working with all of our current kinship caregivers. So those 75% of those families, we're working with them to get them licensed with this new process. And a lot of the things we've already done, like the clearances we've done, but we have to go out and do the new assessment form and make sure that, all of that is documented and uploaded in our system. And I think the biggest positive change we've seen has just been the process and how it is so much more streamlined for our families and our staff. The feedback that we're hearing from them as well is that it's less cumbersome, it's more manageable. They feel good about being able to license kinship caregivers faster, but still thoroughly, and not have to kind of drag it out like it felt before. So I think right now, while it's not perfect, and we know we're going to be continuing to make changes and tweaks like we've all talked about today, it's working well.
awesome. Okay, I'm going to do a lightning round, 1 minute each. What piece of advice do you have? Like, was there anything in particularly helpful in going live that you'd like to share? So, Lindsay?
I think one of the things that was really helpful for us is that before we rolled out the policy and the forms and everything, we met with all the staff who do this work and said, look, take a look at this. What are we missing? And I think it really helped with first of all, it helped with buy-in, but also helped in trying to make any adjustments that we needed at the last minute. So I felt like really involving them in that decision making, and then the rollout helped with communication and making sure everybody understood what the requirements were, but also it helped with the buy-in and helped us create a better product ultimately so that we could serve families.
Awesome. Becky, what's your advice?
Two things come to mind. One was we were really fortunate in Maryland to have a true team effort. So everybody from our local departments to our state office, to our legal partners here in our state office, to our training teams, our communication office, everybody really worked together and was responsible for different pieces of this. And we have, still have meetings every 2 weeks where these groups are coming together, not only to make sure that it's this practice is being implemented well, but also so we can make sure that when issues come up, we can discuss them and address them quickly and figure out how to continue moving forward. The second thing that I would just mention is we did in-person trainings across the state. We facilitated in-person Kin First trainings to get people excited about it, but also to get people up to date on what the new practice was going to look like. And we're continuing that training when we're calling it kinship roundtables. And the kinship roundtable idea is an ongoing opportunity for staff from the local departments of social service who are doing that actual work to come together with our staff at the state office to talk about what's actually working. And one session is focused on forms, and one session is focused on the policy. And they have been incredibly well attended. And I think that's going to allow us to continue to collaborate with the people who are doing the work at the, hands-on level.
Awesome. Jessica, what's your 60-second advice?
Basically everything I already said. Leverage existing policies if you can. Early collaboration is key. I mean, that was huge for us. A proactive communication, making sure the messaging is out there from you all first. And then the last thing I would say, if you choose a model like we did, where we didn't require legacy caregivers to become licensed or approved, perhaps offer some type of incentive to encourage participation. We did financial incentives and hosted fingerprinting events, and we did have some, it motivated some of our legacy caregivers to opt in and complete the approval process.
Awesome. Thank you. And Port Gamble, I'll give you the last word. What's your piece of advice for others that are going live?
I think for tribes, I would really just say, listen and get a hold of all of your past and present caregivers, really get their feedback on what is working, what isn't working, and what works for your tribe in your community. Add in cultural pieces to your training. I think that has been the biggest part that we have really been able to kind of do, is just add in those cultural trainings and be a part of our hours. But listen to your past and your current caregivers, foster parents, what works, what forms, to kind of go forward, what's easy. And I think that's my biggest advice. Thanks.
Awesome. Anna, can I pass it back to you to remind everybody we have an optional Q&A after this? So.
You sure can. And it's thank you all so much for sharing all that fabulous information. I want to share a couple of other opportunities that we have here at the Grand Families and Kinship Support Network, which is that we are going to be hosting a storytelling learning community. So how to tell your story, whether you be a nonprofit, whether you be an agency, and you can learn more and apply by March 7 at that link, and you will be getting these slides. And then also we've designated certain programs as exemplary kinship programs, including Tennessee's Relative Caregiver Program. And you can find those on our website. We now have a process where you can apply to have a practice designated as exemplary. So this could be just a discrete practice at your agency or organization. And we encourage you to apply and reach out with any questions about that opportunity. And that's due by April 22nd. We are having our next webinar on March 18, and encourage you to register and attend that one if you're able. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier at the top of the webinar, Marina and Heidi are both subject matter experts here at the Grand Families and Kinship Support Network. We also have a full staff, including 2 technical assistance specialists, Kylie Kern, who you've seen in the chat, and Shayla Bottoms, who can answer your questions and help connect you with resources. And these requests can be small or large. And there's a link to that form. And then finally, please follow us on LinkedIn because we have a very robust LinkedIn page where we share a lot of resources in between our newsletter, which you all will all be signed up to receive. So as Marina noted, we are having a Q&A right after this. So the link is in the chat. So please join us over there. We're switching platforms so that you can ask questions directly, but we got so many great questions in the chat, which I will be asking of the panelists as soon as we log off. So you'll see the link, I believe, right? Kylie's the last one to have dropped it in the chat. You'll see it says WebZoom US. And so we will see you on the other side. And thank you again, Jessica, Lindsay, Joylina, Cheryl, Marina, Heidi, Becky, everybody. It was a great discussion and learned a lot of great uplifting info. So thank you all.